Good afternoon, everybody. I remember when Elizabeth sent through the agenda for these 2 days, and I look at it with trepidation and think, where am I going to be speaking? I'm hoping it's not going to be, maybe the worst one might be the first one tomorrow, I don't know, or just after lunch. This one hopefully will be okay. Running into tea, the last lap, as it were. And then I was also a little fearful because I'm actually going to stand here and talk about a book. And I thought, how do I make a book exciting? And particularly after Dr. Gray's lecture, which I thought was very engaging. I really feel a bit challenged now to stand and talk about a book. But hopefully we'll make it interesting and engaging and useful. So we're going to talk about the British Council for Officers Guide to Specification. And there's a little bit of background, because many of you may not know what the British Council for Officers is. It's been around quite a long time, founded in 1990 in London, and its purpose is to research, develop and communicate best practice in all aspects of the office sector. So I think it's useful as we go through this discussion just to think this information is focused on offices, so it's not applicable to other sectors. And the BCO has become an established and well-respected body, certainly in London, certainly in the UK. My sense is that its influence further abroad and around the world is less established and less well known. But I would suggest that a lot of the guidance in the BCO guide is of value and of interest for anywhere around the world in office buildings. I think the other key thing is that the guide is a regular publication. It's been around a while and is an expected publication. And whilst it doesn't purport to be anything quite like the Barney or Strakosch guidance or indeed the Guide D guidance, it does like to think that it joins a family of documents that provide guidance on good vertical transportation design. So the one that is here is really hot off the presses. This is the sixth guide, and it was literally published last Friday. So I was also a little anxious that I was going to be standing here today talking about a guide that was yet to be published, and therefore everything that I had on my slides might not actually come to fruition. But I was very pleased to see that it was published before standing here today, and even more pleased to see that the content hadn't changed. It's a hard copy and also available for the first time as an online version, which is quite interesting because it's fully indexed online, so you can search by topics and subjects, and it also hyperlinks into a lot of further reading articles. So there may be some subjects where it offers further reading, some links, quite a lot of links into Guide D for further more established and detailed reading. And in terms of how the process of coming to this edition came about, there were 100 professionals from the industry working for just over a year. And in terms of the lift section, there were 5 of us working on the vertical transportation section. And I thought you wanted to see some pictures of us all. And there's only myself and John that's here today. I was in disguise in those days with a little bit of facial hair. And the other guys aren't here, but Julian Ollie from Arup, Simon Russett from Horley, Bill Evans from D2E, and John Stokes from Vertical Transportation Studio, who's here today with us. And then we had a technical chair in Neil Pennell from Land Securities. In terms of the purpose of the guide, well, I like to think that lift and escalators are a building's heart. If the people are the blood in the building, then the lifts and escalators are the heart. They're the things that pump the people around the building. And when we get it right, if we're honest, nobody much notices. But when we get it wrong, everybody notices. And it causes a real problem. And buildings' reputations and value can suffer dramatically. And so I think this guide is very, very important. But I think the important thing to remember is its intended audience. This is not a Guide D document. It's a simple set of conceptual benchmarks for an interested but probably not that well-informed audience, to give them a set of benchmarks. So developers, architects, letting agents, is to give them information about intelligent questions to ask, intelligent things to check about good lift design. Again, it's not saying you must do it this way. It's saying this is one way of doing it. This is what the BCO considers to be a good benchmark. In doing this guide, we wanted to adopt a few principles in the revision. We wanted to align the advice more closely with other established benchmarks, such as CIBSE Guide D. And there's a sense that there's a better network of people talking to each other more frequently now that have an influence over these guides, and there's an opportunity with that established network to get a little bit more alignment in the advice. We wanted to recognise the prevalence of destination control, certainly in the office sector and certainly in London. We wanted to take another step away from the interval, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We wanted to recognise the continuing trend towards increasing occupancy densities in offices. And we wanted to adopt demand patterns that are based on actual building survey data. And we wanted to consider adopting real-world car load factors. We talked a lot about those last two in yesterday's session, and may discuss these again later. So in terms of alignment, and as I said, this is really a guide for the layman user, and we wanted to establish a set of benchmarks that they could check against. And whilst it isn't a guide D, we were very focused on trying to avoid confusion. And whilst these were simple benchmarks, they needed to be broadly consistent with the foundation principles in guide D. And that was quite a challenge for us, because we wanted to start to put more detail in, and sometimes it's quite hard to simplify complex issues, because you kind of start to open a can of worms and you think, well, if we say this, then we've got to say that, and if we say that, then we've got to say this. And before long, you're writing 5 pages on one little issue. So it was quite a challenge to try to keep it simple, but nevertheless consistent. And it needed to provide appropriate cross-referencing to further reading, so that where that guidance is simple guidance, it tells you where to go to find out a little bit more, should you wish. And that we're hoping that the revision of Guide D that's underway at the moment for publication in 2015 will continue that alignment, so that we will continue to bring these guides almost under an iterative publication process through to a point where there's good, consistent, quality advice. So to look at the other principle that this new guide adopts, destination control or no destination control. Now, the last guide had 2 different sections. It had a section for conventional control and a section for destination control. This time we felt that we wanted to move away from that. We felt that the market momentum, again, office sector, again, London, but we feel the market momentum is moving towards destination as a de facto standard. And we felt that tenants are expecting it, often regardless of the performance impact. And we had some discussions in the tea break earlier today about destination control being put on duplex pairs or triplets, and how much benefit you get. Indeed, may you get a degradation of performance when you apply it on those kind of small groups. But nevertheless, we see it's there, we see it's in the market. And we also thought, well, where is the justification for a different set of performance criteria? We're trying to design a lift system to serve people. People's perception of what an acceptable waiting time is doesn't change from a destination system to a conventional system. They're ignorant of the control system, they don't care, most of them, but they are sensitive to a waiting time. So this new guide now kind of brings that guidance together, and it provides a single set of performance criteria and proposes that that performance criteria is applicable for both destination control and conventional control. It is simplifying the guidance and the advice. Interval or waiting time. As a proposal, and to a certain extent these are maybe my thoughts a little bit more than the committee's group, but we kind of felt, I think, in recollection, that few lay people understand the interval concept. I certainly have seen horror show terms in specs like that, average waiting service interval, which kind of, for me, gives evidence that this interval of waiting time isn't necessarily that understood by the layperson. By a layperson, maybe I mean maybe an architect that maybe gets involved with lifts from a spatial and design perspective, or from a performance perspective, maybe not so often. But we do feel that most people can intuitively understand the concept of waiting time. And we also felt that with this prevalence of destination control, in order to look at destination control's theoretical performance, you're naturally going to be using simulation more and more. And of course, simulation supports a good focus on waiting time as a performance criterion. So it all seemed to us to suggest that we could take yet another step away from interval and simply refer to waiting time as the most appropriate performance criterion to reference in terms of your foundation of performance. So this 2014 guide makes no mention of interval as a performance benchmark. It only references waiting time, or average waiting time. Another very important area is population, and I can only really touch with the time we have on this document here, the occupied density study that the BCO published in 2013. It's a freely available document, and certainly after yesterday's discussion, Gina and I are going to share this information in terms of how it might inform the new Guide D. And this density study was kind of commissioned to challenge the sense that occupancy densities were rising again in the office market. And a real-world trend survey was commissioned, and the BCO surveyed more than 380 properties across the UK in many different sectors that comprise somewhere around 25 million square foot of office space, 2.5 million square metres. So quite a significant study. And they concluded that the overall mean density per person that they were seeing was 1 person per 10.9 square metres net internal. The equivalent 2009 guide had concluded 1 per 11.8 square metres. There's a wealth of information in that publication that they've done. These are just certain slides and certain graphs extracted. So what we have across the bottom here is density bands. So we have 4 up here, 38 up here. The red bars are 2009 data, the green bars are 2013. And the key thing really that was identified was down here in the 6, 7, 8 and 9. There's quite significantly more buildings being observed in those high density zones than there were in 2009. There is still the zones up here, and we'll talk a little bit more about those, but it was really seen that there was a move in terms of percentage of buildings towards these denser 7, 8, 9s. In terms of by sector and region, you can see by the sector down the left-hand side. I guess the thing that surprised me when I saw this data, more in terms of region, was that we see down here in the south and the southwest of the country much higher densities than in London, which initially kind of feels a bit counterintuitive. But it was felt that this data here was kind of reflecting the prevalence of call centres and very high density office space that are typically located in places like Scotland, where there's maybe lower land costs certainly, and probably lower labour costs. And that these higher than expected values were recognising the fact that in many office buildings in London, they have the budget to create spaces such as conference facilities or staff dining facilities or quite extensive meeting room facilities. So the floors that are occupied as office space may be being occupied at 1 per 7, 1 per 8, but they have quite a significant amount of space that isn't regularly occupied. So when you average it out across the net of the entire building, you end up with maybe a higher number than you might anticipate. The BCO also got a lot of data from IPD as data, and this graph here kind of plots density square metre per workplace between 2008 and 2012. And that kind of showed this diminishing trend, but it was kind of suggesting that it was flattening out here. So they looked at another level of the data from IPD, and they looked at the same time period, but over common buildings, so buildings that appeared in every single one of those data sets. And that seemed to show a much more marked increase in density, but kind of suggesting that it was plateauing out. And certainly in the BCO report, one will see commentary that suggests that proposes this might be approaching some kind of economic balance point, where to get any denser, you don't get any benefit. But in summary on population, it was certainly felt by the BCO that there was justification to propose a denser environment for lifts to work within, but not a significant move maybe, or not too much of a significant move. So in 2009, this is what the guide was saying: you should design elevators for 1 person per 12 square metres, reflecting a workplace density of 1 per 10, with a utilisation factor of just over 80%. So utilisation factor, this is all about absenteeism, hot desking, sickness. What the guide is now saying is exactly the same as it said in 2009, but then it's also adding this other bit here that says you may want to consider, if you believe the brief is a high density office, or likely to become a high density office, you may want to consider a 1 per 8 with 20% absenteeism, so a net 1 per 10. So it's providing kind of two different options for consideration. And certainly I think from the work that we're doing in London at the moment in the office sector, we are seeing that kind of 1 per 10, 1 per 8 requests coming through quite regularly. In terms of demand profile, this was probably the subject of the most significant change in the BCO guide. And again, there was this informal observation that for some time suggested that this established 15% pure up-peak demand may no longer be valid. Certainly Peters, Meta and Haddon, back in 1996, published a paper that observed the emerging dominance of the lunchtime peak as the more demanding time of the day. Back in 2004, and I know this is close to Gina's heart, Stanhope published a paper, albeit with significantly challenged methodology, that again proposed that what they observed did not observe this big 15% morning up peak. And then part of Guide D 2010, you'll see some data that was published by Peters Research, again publishing the results of surveys of buildings around the world, or of demand survey, which again did not demonstrate evidence of this 15% pure up peak. And the BCO looked at this, and we decided that with the evidence that was now presented, particularly I think the evidence in Guide D from the Peters Research study, that there was sufficient justification for the BCO to adopt the CIBSE Guide D demand criteria for the 2014 guide. So now all of a sudden we have two documents that are proposing, as one way of simulating it, a similar demand criteria. So you can see here tabulated for the morning up peak and the lunchtime peak, the 2009 guide, which had this rather simplistic 100% up, 15%, is now moving towards the currently published Guide D, which is a 12% peak with mixed traffic. And likewise for lunchtime, the 12% has moved to 13%. The traffic is still pretty much mixed, slightly different statistical. So now we have alignment at last between BCO and CIBSE. The guide retains its previous advice to use multiple simulation runs to assess theoretical performance. And it retains its advice that demand profile should rise and fall around the specified peak handling capacity. But quite importantly, I think the guide does not define the template precisely. You will not see a picture of the template that you have in Guide D in BCO. And the thinking again is going back to the audience. The audience is a relatively intended audience, is a layman audience. So we want them to understand that those are the key numbers they should be looking for. You know, that it's been designed around 12% up peak, that the traffic is mixed, and that the demand template rose and fall. And again, it just points out that the results should present the average values as measured across the multiple runs for the most intense 5-minute period. Another subject that we looked at in some detail, and again is a subject of a lot of debate and discussion yesterday and again today, is car loading. And this idea, this image obviously exaggerates the issue, but the issue of, in our 26-person car or 2,000 kilogram car, how many people in the real world will load that car? And the need to think about, when we simulate theoretical performance, we should be simulating car loadings with a real factor rather than maybe a theoretical one. Again, Guide D, there's a lot of information published. There's a lot of information published from previous documents, like certainly by Dr. Barney. But you will find this car capacity table in there. And this car capacity table relates rated loads here to maximum areas, which again are defined, reference part 1 here, but the same thing exists for part 20. And then proposes another factor here called actual capacity. And we were debating yesterday whether actual capacity might be termed probable capacity, but whether it's probable or whether it's actual, the key thing is it's less than rated. And it's suggesting that in the real world, you simply won't get 26 people in a 26-person car. And therefore we should take account of that in our simulations and in our design criteria. On the left side is the 2009 guide and what it said. So it said where cars loaded normally to not more than 80% of rated capacity. And then it proposed that for scenic lift cars there should be a lower factor. 2014 guide simplifies this and I think aligns as well better with the current thinking and the probable, though not confirmed, direction that maybe Guide D might move in. There's a lot of debate and discussion, and I know Marilisa has a presentation tomorrow with Jana that I think will be very interesting on this subject. But for the 2014 guide, we've tried to move it to a measurement by area. So and moving by area and therefore moving to a more probable realistic capacity. So it says for all traffic conditions, the average car loading in any 5 minutes, including scenic lifts, should not be more than 80%, assuming 0.21 square meters per person. Now there was a lot of discussion about that. At one point we had a nice, what I thought was a nice simple table, and rated capacity and actual capacity. But for some reason that was felt that that wasn't clear, it was getting a little bit too complicated for people. But I think we made a step in the right direction. Personally, I think the next guide maybe makes a little clearer. It's moving away from rated towards actual. In terms of performance times themselves, there is no change, and there seems to be no justification. You know, if we think that 25 seconds was the right target up peak average waiting time in 2009, people haven't changed. There's no evidence that people's expectations have changed significantly. So the target up peak average waiting time remains at 25 seconds. The comment here is same from 2009 guide, that if you have a strong average time to destination, you may be getting that at the expense of average waiting times, and it may be acceptable to allow the waiting time to roll out a little bit, if by doing so you're getting good average time to destinations. Likewise, average time to destination should be no more than 90 seconds, but again the thinking is, if you're delivering a very, very strong waiting time, you might allow your time to destination to roll out a little bit. And in terms of lunchtime, the guidance remains unchanged, that a two-way lunchtime average waiting time across all floors of no more than 40 seconds. A new piece of information in the guide recommends that performance should be tested with one lift out of service to understand the sensitivity of the system to failure and to indicate what level of reduced service would be provided in those circumstances. Again, it doesn't necessarily say what that level should be, but it's just providing some guidance to the reader to say, have you asked your design team or have you checked what the service is with one lift out? How close are you to saturation with the design that's being proposed? Some additional new guidance, just as headlines. There's a bit of information in there just about the number of destination panels you might want in a lobby, referencing a benchmark that typically when for every 60 people that you're getting in your peak demand in that 5-minute period, you should consider one panel. There's a bit of additional information on dedicated goods lifts in office buildings, and just picking up a design metric there in terms of speed, suggesting that a goods lift should be able to go from the main access level to the highest floor in around 50 to 60 seconds. Again, we've seen examples maybe of 14, 15, 16-story buildings, office buildings with 1 meter a second goods lifts in them. Nothing wrong with that, but we're suggesting that actually that's probably quite a slow speed for building at that kind of height. There's some additional guidance in there on appropriate use of car park shuttle lifts, of lifting platforms, of vehicle lifts. There's new guidance on appropriate use of evacuation lifts. And there's new guidance on integrated security systems and the prevalence of destination control integrated into security turnstiles and the like. So as a concluding summary, I'm a little bit biased, but even as an objective looker, I think it's a good document. I think in terms of the lift content, it provides a good set of benchmark design criteria that hopefully are relatively easily understood. We're hoping that it will continue to be extensively referenced in the London market and across the UK. I'd like to see it referenced a little bit more around the world. Maybe it will be if it's cross-linked with CIBSE a little stronger, because I think it's a good positive step towards alignment with other more comprehensive guidance. And that is all I have to say.